for the public. We have been joined, the proposal before us would require landlords or foreclosing owner to file with the city's Office of Housing Stability a copy of the notice to quit or notice of lease non-renewal or expiration when the landlord or foreclosing owner serves the notice to quit or notice of lease non-renewal or expiration to the tenant or former homeowner. All notices to quit and notices of lease non-renewal for expiration shall also include information about basic housing rights and resources. The city's Office of Fair Housing and Equity would have investigatory jurisdiction over the provisions of this ordinance, and the Inspectional Services Department would have enforcement oversight. With us today from the administration is Sheila Dillon, Chief of Housing, Dominic Williams, Office of Housing Stability, DND, Katie Ford, Office of Housing Stability, DND, Chris English, Chief of Staff, ISD, Will Onuaha, Director of Office of Fair Housing and Equity, Andrew Espinoza, Director of Investigations, Office of Fair Housing and Equity. I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, and we will all make a brief statement, and then we'll get right to the heart of the matter. The goal of today's hearing and why it's happening so fast is because we have an eviction moratorium that is coming to an end on the 17th of this month. It's important that we as a city respond as much as we can to such housing crisis. And the question before us today is whether the Housing Notification Act, as currently proposed by the mayor's office, does much, if anything, to help with that current crisis that the city of Boston is going to be dealing with. I will, in my remarks after my colleagues speak, explain some suggestions we've heard from folks around the community, and we will do our best to create, I think, the most effective response that we can at the city level, understanding the limited powers of municipal government in this moment. So at that point, or with that, I'm going to again check and see if any other colleagues have joined us. And I will turn it over to Councillor Brayden for opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm interested to hear what folks have to say this afternoon about this proposal. I think it's really important that we track tenancies that are terminated, track evictions, and just get some idea of what's going on in the housing market at the local level. And hopefully this ordinance or this will help us know what's going on and help us strategize about adequate responses to that crisis. So I have a lot to learn, so I look forward to hearing the discussion this afternoon. Thank you.
Councillor Bach.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And forgive me, I'm in transit right now, which means walking, but I just want to say I'm really glad we're having this. I agree with your amount that the city can do that. Thinking as you were reading about the governor's order for why we're doing this remotely, that as we all know, the public health emergency we're under has not abated. And so to have the eviction moratorium be lifted when all the other measures are still in place, I think really makes no sense at all. And we've spent a lot of city resources, state resources, and federal ones getting people housed. And so this goes in the opposite direction. That said, I think we should be doing all that we can. And these notice provisions may help us slow things down, may help us hold the line while we try to get more done at the state level. And I'm interested as you are in how we make them as strong as possible. So thank you, and thank you to everyone who's here today.
Councillor Baker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just here to listen, and I'm glad we're doing something, trying to do something on our part here. No real comments, just listen and see what we can do. Thank you.
So, and then just myself, I think there are certain issues I have with the proposed legislation. One, I don't think it goes as far as the city can or should. Two, I do think requiring putting the burden on landlords is naive, and I think it's not going to actually really help people be informed. I think the city needs to be broader and take direct action and have, on an annual basis, put out to all tenants and all homeowners a list of their rights and resources. It's neutrally done. It's just done maybe on move-in date every September. Just be done with it. Then if you're going to add any additional burden on landlords or anybody else, then that would be only if they're moving to remove somebody. The question I have, however, is if we're going to be collecting notices to quit at the City of Boston, what languages are you going to pursue to assure that that doesn't become part of a public records request? As you know, notices to quit are currently not publicly available. What we don't want is for landlords to be able to simply do a FOIA request or public records request for that week's notices to quit that come into the Office of Housing Stability. What are you going to do to protect people's privacy? That information isn't publicly available right now, and that's pre even eviction. We already have issues with evictions and cases being available for people to screen tenants. I think this is allowing, how are we going to prevent people from having access to that? So not only that, there's the question of enforcement. This is based off of a complaint driven, that is a complaint saying I wasn't given information to know who to file this complaint with. So it's a workaround and it's a problem. I hope that could be resolved by just having the blanket, know your rights. These are issues, these are things that are happening to get ahead of this. But if we just start with people need to drive this complaint, I think you're going to end up, I don't know how honestly it can be enforced. Also, how you make a tenant whole, right? We know that this doesn't prevent the eviction process. This doesn't slow it down in the slightest bit. And at the end of the day, they'll still be in court with no defense, this being no defense to it. So, and the fines that are assessed, that money seems to be going to the city. It doesn't even go to the tenants. So what is in it for a tenant to come forward with this information? Besides that they can have a fine assessed against their landlord who, as we can see with the current fines right now, if they ignore it, it just becomes a lien on their home. They can pay in property taxes. I think then there's the other issue of what else then can we do as a city? Well, we can look to other cities and look at the emergency declarations and boards of health that they've done in Somerville and Cambridge, basically saying that a landlord can't cause a constable or sheriff to levy an execution in an occupied unit, to physically go in there and to remove their thing because we're in a pandemic. Now, the CDC has stronger language actually that says you can't even file with some sort of written notice from the tenant. That being said, if we were to track this with the pandemic, we can go further and longer than the CDC right now and provide at least that ultimate step in protection. And then finally, in terms of funding and money, what's it to us to put our money where our mouths are as a city of Boston and say, listen, if you are not going to evict, if you're going to cancel rent, we're willing to give you relief in your property taxes, which is, I think, one of the biggest requests that we have from people. Right now, we are offering rent relief to landlords. There is no requirement that they don't evict. There is a requirement that they notify the city if they change the contract. So I think there's some holes that we need to fill in. There's some steps that we could take. And there's certainly the beginning, I think it's the beginning of a good conversation, but it certainly shouldn't be where we end. So with that, we've been joined by other colleagues, Councillor Anissa Sabi-George, Councillor Julia Mejia, and Councillor Ricardo Arroyo. Did I miss any other councillors? We're just doing opening statements. So Councillor Sabi-George, if you'd like to go.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for hosting this hearing today. I think, like colleagues, very anxious about what the next couple of days holds for our residents across the city of Boston, certainly across the Commonwealth, but in particular the city of Boston. And as I think everyone's well aware, I have a specific interest in how we're protecting our families from the risk of becoming homeless as we work to end homelessness for our families here in the city of Boston. The concern I have is creating additional families, children and their families who may be homeless as soon as next week. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I look forward to this conversation and see that we've got a cast of well-informed and knowledgeable panelists today. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councilor Julia Mejia.
Sorry, Councilor Edwards, I'm here. I echo the sentiment in terms of just a lot of the anxiety that we've been hearing out in these streets in terms of what's going to happen. And so looking forward to participating in the conversation. And like you always say, it's coming out of this with some really concrete things that we can either marinate on and percolate or push forward. So looking forward to just being a part of the conversation and asking questions when it's time to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Arroyo.
Not much from me here. We know that we have an impending crisis. It's like, I've called it the iceberg since April or March looming. And so I'm just interested in getting to solutions. And that's where I'm at.
Okay. So I think that's it for the councilors. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Sheila. If you want to just walk us through.
Yeah, so I thought I would just open it up and then I would, I'm here with, several well-informed colleagues that can discuss this issue further. But for the record, my name is Sheila Dillon and I'm Chief of Housing for the City of Boston and the Director of the Department of Neighborhood Development. And I want to certainly thank you all for being here as we all, share a great worry about the upcoming weeks and months. We're here to talk about and discuss with you the Housing Stability Notification Act. We feel pretty sure this is just one piece of a larger, more comprehensive strategy. As you mentioned, Councilor, the governor's eviction moratorium is coming to an end in several days. And the city's been working really hard on this issue for many months, trying different things to get more money in tenants' hands, working with big landlords, having them promise that they will work with their tenants. And now, before you is the Housing Stability Notification Act. Probably as important as what the city's doing, we have been working very, very closely with all of the advocates and our state partners on the state response. The governor is ending the moratorium, so it is good to see. Although we're starting to evaluate. We are evaluating the resources the state is putting forward on this issue statewide. As you know, that they have put up $171 million in this fiscal year for this effort. Is it enough? We have to see, right? There's no good data on there. There's data on what we think could happen, worst case scenario, but we're going to have to monitor whether or not that $171 million is sufficient. And if it's not, we're going to have to work with all of our partners to make sure that additional resources are found. But they're putting up additional money for RAFT, as we are for our rent arrearage, and staff will talk about that. They're funding additional mediation and legal services, which I think is probably one of the most exciting pieces of their plan, and funding the expansion of home base in case families do need to move. It provides up to 12 months of rental assistance. So I think, we need to work very closely with the state, because we're not going to have enough resources on our own. And then hopefully come, December, January, we're going to have, a different federal administration as well. But I do want to just say, I agree with you. We're going to monitor the situation very closely. We want to monitor it with you and respond accordingly as we see the numbers and what they're going to be. But I want to hand this over to Dominique Williams, who's going to talk about the ordinance that we're here to talk about today. Katie Ford is going to put it in context of what other actions the Office of Housing Stability is taken. And here with William Anua, who's going to talk about how they would investigate these cases, and Chris English on the fining piece. I will just conclude with, I think we all recognize that this is just, one piece to get good information into tenants' hands. And while we are doing mailings to large groups of tenants in areas where we have seen the most evictions. There is nothing, it is important for tenants to get resources, as they are getting served legal notices. So we don't think it's a panacea, but it is just one piece of many actions. But with that, if it's okay with you, I'll hand this over to Dominique Williams, who will walk us through the ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. And thank you, Councilor Edwards, for hosting this timely and important hearing today and inviting us to discuss the importance of this ordinance. My name is Dominique Williams, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Office of Housing Stability. We know that Boston's tenants are facing the end of the eviction moratorium this Saturday, and we're equally as concerned as the council is. We want to ensure that tenants have the knowledge and the resources at their disposal to preserve their housing and to make sure that their families are able to stay safe and stable during this unprecedented time. Just to start, OHS has been at the forefront of this crisis since the early days of March, when we saw that the pandemic was first breaking. On March 11th, OHS was among the first offices in the state to call for the closing of the housing courts when it became apparent that this rapidly spreading virus was leading vulnerable tenants to be exposed through in-person contact and housing court hearings, or at the end of an eviction through court without a home to shelter in place. In April, OHS led Boston to become among the first in the country to set up a rental relief fund, and that has gone on to assist hundreds of families with back rent. In May, we needed to find a little bit of hope in a dark time, personally in our office, after having received thousands of calls and emails from constituents who were just desperate for assistance in terms of understanding their rights. So what we decided to do was to get active. And as a team, we began to meet weekly to plan out how our office was going to respond to the end of the eviction moratorium. At the time, that was set to occur in August, and thankfully, Governor Baker did extend that to October 17th. But either way, we wanted to be prepared to help the thousands of constituents we knew that were going to be coming to us for help. So those early meetings helped to lay the foundation for us to combine our knowledge of housing crisis coordination, our knowledge of resource development and program implementation to help us to create a response to the end of the moratorium. Ultimately, we came up with something that was well thought out and well coordinated with our internal team, our external vendors, and our multiple partners in the legal and financial assistance communities. So we're proud today to present the Housing Stability Notification Ordinance, a fruit of those early internal conversations, as we know will greatly benefit Boston's residents. The purpose of the ordinance is to promote housing stability of Boston residents by ensuring that they have information about their rights and about housing resources that may be available to them. The ordinance will require landlords and foreclosing owners to notify OHS when they serve a notice to quit or when they provide a notice of lease non-renewal. It also requires landlords and foreclosing owners to provide information about housing rights and resources to residents whenever they serve one of those notices. The ordinance requires tenants to self-report the violation to the Office of Fair Housing and Equity, who will then investigate the violation. And finally, after an investigatory period and a determination, OFH will hand the case over to ISD to either issue a warning or a $300 fine. We have today with us my colleague and friend, Will Anoha, Executive Director of the Office of Fair Housing and Equity, to answer some questions about the investigation arm of the ordinance. And we also have Chris English, the Chief of Staff at ISD, Inspectional Services, to answer any questions about the enforcement of the ordinance. So now I'm going to hand it over to Katie Ford, our Operations Manager and OHS, to discuss the additional aspects of our post-moratorium plan.
So I appreciate that. And I think that that would be better served in another hearing. I really want to keep this conversation to the language of the ordinance and what we can do and what we'll be voting on. So I'm going to, unless Katie, your comments are specific to the ordinance and how you're responding to it, I'm going to go on to, I think it's Will and to Chris, specifically again on how the ordinance is going to play out.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
You can skip me, that's fine.
Okay, so Will? I think we're going to discuss the self-reporting aspect of the ordinance.
Will,
No, you're still on mute.
Will, you're on mute. Oh.
Maybe while Will is coordinating this technical issue, we can go on to Chris English on ISD's role.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, sorry, I don't know what happened. Oh God, I think we need new technology. But anyway, thank you for having us. It's actually, I'm joined with my Director of Investigations, Andrew. So we'll just talk very briefly about the investigations piece. So the Office of Fair Housing and Equity already, well, first of all, let me start off by saying good afternoon, Madam Chair, and thank you for having us. And good afternoon to all the other city councilors and all my other colleagues across the city. So the Office of Fair Housing and Equity, as you know, already has a built-in investigatory division within our office that already investigates housing discrimination cases. So for this segment, or in order to make this ordinance work, we would be actually able to do the investigations, which Andrew will talk about if you want to know detailed information about it. But the actual structure of how it is pretty much functions as a checklist. It would not require like a lot of analysis or anything like that. It would be more of the processes that we currently already use through our investigators to make sure or look at whether a landlord had done the three things that my colleague Dominique had just mentioned, from the notice to quit, the 30-day notice to quit, the information sent to Office of Housing Stability and so forth. And if any of those things were not met, essentially what would happen is we would then forward a memo to ISD telling them that this person had not, or this landlord had not met the requirements based on our investigation, and then it'll be up to ISD to either fine or issue a warning. So that's basically it in a nutshell. And just in the interest of time, I'll stop there unless anyone has any questions for me.
Go ahead, Chris.
Counselor, thank you. Just once the Inspectional Services Department receives information from the Office of Fair Housing and Equity related to violation of the terms of the ordinance, our team over here would draft up the violation and deliver. We have constables on staff that can serve legal notice. We would serve it to the property owner or the violator. The current language of the ordinance outlines that, these are non-criminal dispositions. So there's a built-in appeal and hearing process. We have hearing officers on our team in case, an offender wants to appeal the fine or violation. So as far as the operations of just issuing the violations, we would do that consistent with how we do the rest of the ordinances and regulations that we enforce. Counselor, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. So we can just go ahead and go through with questions from counselors specifically about the ordinance, questions, suggestions, and we'll go from there. We'll start with Counselor Braden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the three requirements are the 30-day notice to quit. What are the other two? that the landlord has to comply with?
So any non-renewal notice, if they're not renewing their lease, and if they serve a 14-day notice to quit or a 30-day notice to quit, they would have to notify OHS or send a copy of that document to OHS.
And notifying OHS is an important step that they would have to comply with.
Yeah, that's part of it. The main thing though is that they get that document in that OHS would draft that would have the list of tenant resources and rights that would be in the notices that go directly to the tenant so they can have access to those resources.
Okay, that's very, very important piece. I'm a little curious as to the level of cooperation that you're going to expect from a landlord in terms of giving tenants the information. That's I'm a little skeptical about that. Is there any way to, how do we ensure that they actually do that?
If I could, there is there isn't a way to ensure. So tenants who don't receive, or attorneys that are working with their tenants that don't receive, are going to have to report. This was several years ago, and Councilor Edwards will remember, we had filed the Jim Brooks Act, which was going to require some of these components prior to a landlord being able to evict. That didn't pass. It languished, and you know, it was so basic. It boggles my mind that the state house or the state legislature couldn't pass something so basic. So this is what we can do within our authorities. We can't hold up an eviction. We can fine.
Okay. And the fine is $300?
Chris, you would talk about what it could be?
Sure. So all municipal fines, unless we get state approval via home rule petition, have a maximum value of up to $300. We would need to include some amended language for this ordinance to actually itemize that out as a fine up to $300, which would say each day's violation, each day's non-compliance would be considered a separate violation.
Okay.
So that it essentially could be up to $300 per day. And we would look to issue those fines in accordance with General Law, Chapter 40U, so that they could then, if left unpaid, be attachable as a lien on the property taxes.
Okay, thank you. That's all for now. Madam Chair, I'm sure others have got questions.
Thank you. Councillor Bach?
Yeah, and I totally agree with Chief Dillon's assessment that it was really a shame that we couldn't get the Jim Brooks Act through when we sent it up to the State House, not least because even that was much more modest than everything that we need. I guess thank you. I had some questions on fines that Chris answered. I guess a question for Will is just, you know, thinking back to our hearing yesterday and kind of the question of shifting responsibility from tenants to other actors proactively on their behalf. I'm just wondering if we've thought at all about whether there's a way to proactively like have OHS like sample check on a set of folks who reach out to it, or sample check on people whose evictions actually get filed and go to that next step. Like, I'm just wondering if there's some way that in addition to taking a self-report, we could think about setting the city up to make maybe landlords fear a little bit that if they don't comply with this, they're more likely to be caught.
Councilor Block, yes, I believe so, because what would happen, from my understanding of how the ordinance will function, is that the moment before it could even get to us, OHS would be in contact with us anyways and would send the information to us, where our shop would be in contact with, I believe it's Dominique and Katie Ford. And once they forward a landlord to us, or a violator to us, or someone who potentially allegedly might have made a violation, then before the commencement of the investigation, we would have gone through those, or we would have had those conversations to then figure out if there's anything they particularly want us to do or should be done or creatively could be done before we start the investigation?
Right. I was just,
Question.
yeah, just trying to make sure that we also are sort of setting ourselves up to have the authority to proactively spot check without a self-report on this. That's the piece that I'm trying to make sure we're set up to do.
How do you do that?
Like if OHS didn't receive a complaint from anybody, but they just said, you know, I think we have a lot of folks in this area, like people seem to be leaving. We don't really know what's going on. Nobody's come and put their hand up, but it would be good if you went over. I'm just trying to think about ways that we could make sure that we're going to have that authority so we could help take the burden off the tenants.
One of the things that we could do, Councilor Bach, is as cases are coming into OHS, since we know we'll be receiving a lot of eviction cases and, you know, pushing people to different resources, is we could add that as a question to our assessment and ask if people have did receive that the resource packet or resource information from their landlord with the notice to quit. We can do that on the front end.
I think that'd be great, because I think we know that the people who don't get this mostly aren't going to know that they didn't get this, right? So I just think that if we could put that so that we're catching it, that'd be great. My other ask is, and this relates to what Councilor Edwards said about September 1st, I wonder if the city would be open to adding a requirement that people's, you know, housing rights be attached just to leases as a matter of course in the city. I thought, you know, September 1st, of course, is the day when 3/4 of the leases in our city go into effect. But it just seems to me, obviously, we're focused on the back end of this problem right now because we're staring down the face of this moratorium. But as long as we're doing legislation, I don't really see a reason why we wouldn't want every tenant in the city to be proactively informed of their rights in that way.
It's a good idea.
Well, let me make that a formal suggestion just on this front.
I will.
Yeah, go ahead.
I thought that there was an opportunity to kind of jump in and highlight the fact that we do have that included as part of the eviction prevention plans that we're now requiring from all developers when they're seeking city funding. So that's kind of underway from the properties that we have an ability to have control over. But it might be a little bit more challenging to actually enforce that for like private market apartments. I don't know. I see Sheila.
Yeah, I mean, I have to look into the legalities of it, but we're saying on any landlord who is renting an apartment and entering into a lease would have to have the tenant's rights attached to that lease.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It seems like it's an exactly parallel situation. Someone's serving a legal notice of some kind, and we're kind of saying, hey, when you do that, you need to let people know about these rights. And then my last question, Madam Chair, is just in the interim, thinking about what we can do with this crisis right now from your offices, because I agree with the chair that we should be looking into everything we can do on the public health side. And I think that it really does boggle my mind that we would use any public resources at any level right now to be getting people out of their homes. But on the immediate OHS side, I wonder how much it cost us to do these citywide mailings around the census. And it just seems to me like maybe we should be sending out proactively a citywide mailing. This is not something we need legislation for, to just kind of cast a very wide sweeping net, tell all of our renters about their rights, and maybe also word it in such a way that we put landlords on notice that the city is particularly concerned about this issue.
Yeah, so just to your point, Councilor Bach, which was something I was going to mention in my introduction, is that one of the things that we did recently do was we did not do a citywide mailer, but we did a lot of research, and we sent out a mailer to 46,000 households that is hitting this week. And we did that because one of our fears is that when tenants receive their notice to quit, which we think they will start getting on Saturday, the 17th, we were very fearful that they would take that letter and think that they would need to move out immediately. So we sent that mailer to approximately 46,000 households in Chinatown, part of Dorchester, East Boston, Mattapan, Mission Hill, Roxbury, and the South End. And what we did, that was in multiple languages. It sends, it has a QR code and it links to a FAQ sheet online. that list resources for folks and also list their rights. And we've actually been receiving calls this week from the people who've received that mailer, and it's been really helpful to them. We use data from our eviction prevention task force to figure out which households we're going to mail that to. We also use unemployment information, the COVID positive information, and information from the Census Bureau in order to determine which neighborhoods we felt were at high risk of eviction. And that is something, a step that we have taken, but we have not done a citywide mailer.
That's great to hear. Could you share that with us at the council, the mailer?
Yeah,
That'd
sure.
be great. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Counselor Baker. Counselor Baker? We've also been joined by Counselor O'Malley. Counselor Baker might be having some technical issues, so I will go to Counselor Sabi George.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to the administration for sharing your work to date. Katie, could you just review the list of who we decided to send those 46,000 notices to? And then if you could just talk a little bit more about the COVID positive one, that perked my interest a little bit.
Sure. So the neighborhoods that the mailer is hitting, it's 46,000 households. It's East Boston, Chinatown, parts of Dorchester. I can get you a specific zip code list later. Mattapan, Mission Hill, Roxbury, and the South End. And we did a lot of analysis from the Eviction Prevention Task Force, so previously filed evictions, as well as where COVID positive cases were in the city of Boston, layered with the unemployment data of people who worked in the service industry. And in all those neighborhoods, there was just, we layered that all on top, and that is where we decided to send this mailer out to these households that we feel are at high risk of eviction.
If we were to expand that, did we pick the 46,000 number because that's where the overlays led us, or was it budget-based?
It was budget-based, and that's also where the map led us.
Yeah, where the map led us. Is there?
We took out BHA housing, other things, because they already had, things in place where they weren't going to evict people for non-payment of rent through the end of the year. So we were able to remove some other areas that we knew were not as high at risk.
Great, thank you. And I don't know who could answer this, but what are we expecting to see on Monday? That's what's so Sunday's the 17th. What are we expecting to see on Monday? What are we most worried about?
Well, I can answer for OHS. From our perspective, we're planning to see a high call volume. We've already started to see our call volume go back up to what was at a high this summer, with receiving about 400 or 500 calls a week. Yesterday, we received about 80. So it's starting to go back up now that people are kind of calling it. More press is being called to the end of the moratorium on Saturday. We know that people, if they are behind on their rent, then they will start to receive those notices this week, but they will not immediately be able to go into court. Landlords still have to provide the notice to quit first. So we're not anticipating increased court action until November.
And how is your, and I'm sorry, Katie, you had more to say there, but.
Yeah, sure. I was just going to say, the main thing that we're going to see on Monday is we're going to see a lot of people calling because that's when we anticipate reopening our rental relief, our city's rental relief fund. So a lot of people are going to be calling for that assistance. It's not a lottery, so they will be calling for that assistance. The other thing that we're also going to see, and also make sure that everyone on the council and everyone else knows, we do anticipate that this CDC moratorium will be in place, but there's another layer to it where the tenant needs to fill out a form, which is also available on our website and has been translated into multiple languages. I'm not sure if the other forms in the languages have been posted online yet, but that is the number one thing you need to make sure your constituents do, is fill out that form and give it to their landlord, which it won't keep them out of court necessarily, but it could keep them in their home through the end of the year. It's very important. We're aggressively making sure that people know about that form. So people will be calling because they are looking for rental assistance and because they may have received a letter from their landlord. So that's what we're going to see. That's what we anticipate seeing on Monday. And we also anticipate there might be some bad actors of landlords that might be locking their tenants out and other things because they've been waiting for this day for a very long time. So we anticipate a lot of landlord tenant issue calls on Monday.
So, and Madam Chair, this is my last question, or sort of, fear or worry about what happens next week. Do you have in place the resources, both the manpower to respond to the added volume of calls? Is our technology ready to handle any of the online pressures? And then also thinking about the forced evictions and the changing of locks, and that anticipating that potentially happening next week. How, if we worked with Boston Police in particular around preparing for that to respond to those calls and those needs, and what can we do to be helpful? What's missing and what can we do to be helpful?
So we have increased capacity for our call center. We know that we will still likely miss calls, but we are going to try and get back to everyone as soon as we can. We've redesigned our webpage so it is extremely user-friendly, boston.gov/housing stability. When you go on there now, it's real easy. You can click on being evicted or I need help paying rent or having issues. It's very user-friendly. We're trying to train the trainers, if you will. Tonight, Dominique's actually training city council staff with Greater Boston Legal Services to deal with eviction defense. So as far as being helpful, again, direct people to our website, to the state's resources as well, and to that CDC form to sign for their landlord to hopefully protect them.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I'm all set.
Councillor Julia Mejia.
Hi, yes, I'm just curious just to make sure that I'm in the right place, because it seems like this ordinance is just to notify residents, right, about what their rights are going to be. And I'm just curious about, I think I heard Sheila say that we won't be able to assess whether or not the landlords are following the rules. I mean, I'm just curious about how we're going to hold landlords accountable if we don't have the mechanism in place to for accountability and ensuring that landlords are notifying their residents of their rights.
I don't
Do you need a translator?
No.
Do you want me to translate?
No, I think it's a really good question. You're absolutely right that the city can't stop an eviction. So there's not going to be anyone in housing court saying, did you get your rights? Did you notify the Office of Housing Stability? Oh, you didn't get that? You can't be evicted. So it is going to be, it is going to be something that we're going to be, monitoring, watching, hearing about, following up on, but we don't have a legal mechanism to stop an eviction until someone gets that information. We just don't have the legal authority to do that. I think it is an interesting idea. Is there some way to spot check the bigger landlords? Certainly we could be working with the advocates and all of the lawyers and mediators will be working with tenants. I think there's ways that we can get this information out, but we can't stop an eviction because it wasn't delivered. I don't know, Katie or Dominique, if you have anything to add.
Nope.
Okay. So, and yesterday we heard there was a proposal that would greatly alleviate rent burdens for low-income housing. And one of the ideas we heard would be to eliminate brokers' fees. What pathways can we put in place to make that happen and utilize and seize this ordinance to be able to do that? And I'm also just curious about, we're talking about this notice to quit, and this is going to really impact low-income communities. And I'm just curious about what kind of protections are we putting in place to help support them and to avoid being served notice to quits to put systems in place that can make it easier for them to reallocate within the city. And then I'm also just curious in terms of just overall readiness, like how ready are we, like to Councilor Sabi George's question, how in terms of staffing, are we ready to receive folks in multiple languages? I know you guys have been doing an enormous, job, like trying to making sure that everything gets translated and that people have access to the information, but people are going to be confused when they get that letter and they're not going to know what notice to quit is. And it's already sounds confusing enough. So I'm just curious in terms of the technical assistance that's going to be provided to families who are calling, and what is that going to look like?
So I think you asked a couple of different questions here. The first is just that when we're sending out that 46,000 mailer, that's going out in multiple languages in accordance with the new city guidelines. So that's already taking place. And then when folks are calling into our office, we have a language line translation service that is able to translate in real time for constituents who are calling and speaking English as a second language. I'm sure there was a couple of questions in there that I missed as well.
If I could add one comment about readiness, the Office of Housing Stability is making money available to have GBLS hire a couple of other attorneys, et cetera. But we have been supporting right to counsel, not to go down a rabbit hole, but what tenants need is they need to be represented in court, right? They need rent payments and they need to be represented in court if it gets that far. And so the state has finally realized that, although we're not seeing right to counsel passed, but they are making $12, maybe $13 million available to put a program in place where tenants would have access to a lot more lawyers and a lot more mediators, but representation at mediation. So we're finally seeing this in place, and they're setting up a 211 line. So we are going to be helping the state design that. Dominique and I sit on that task force, trying to put those components in place, because as this rolls out, tenants are going to, many of them, who need money, who needs assistance beyond resources, just financial resources, are going to need legal representation. So reading, it's good to get your rights. It's really a good thing, and we should be doing this. We should be making owners putting this in place and these notifications in place. But in the end, what tenants really need is they need what other cities and states are doing, and that is right to counsel. So, I think it's a companion piece. So it's unrealistic to think that everybody's going to get a notice and know exactly what to do. But we do need to put some pressure on and monitor and help the state stand up that program as quickly as possible.
So I have one last question, Councilor Edwards. I'm just curious about the outreach to organizations. Which organizations have you guys engaged in helping with whatever outreach? What role have you played in informing your thinking in terms of rollout? Like, just can you talk to me a little bit about your community engagement?
Sure. So we actually have, this is part of our overall post-eviction moratorium plan. We've been working closely with MOIA, the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Investment. We spoke to a group that they hosted with multiple community organizations. We've spoken to different neighborhood groups that have hosted multiple organizations. This morning I was on a call with Age Strong that had over 75 community providers on the call about rental relief fund reopening, as well as other stuff, the other programs that are available at Office of Housing Stability. We also have a plan to be part of the City Hall to Go bus or van truck, I don't know what you want to call it. So we're going to participate in that. We're going to, the first event actually that we're going to be at is the backpack event in Roxbury and Mattapan this weekend. We're going to put in each backpack a one-pager about tenant rights and resources, as well as a copy of the eviction the CDC declaration form that I keep talking about because I feel that it's so important. In addition, our communications team is trying to get us on multiple language news outlets. We've been talking to, your regular channels, BNN and whatever else. And I know that the mayor's been talking about it as press conference. So we're definitely trying to get the word out about what's going to happen with tenants in the city during this crisis, because information is power, and they need to make sure that they're not missing deadlines and that they have access to these financial and legal resources that will be on this flyer that are part of this ordinance.
If I could just add one thing to Katie, in years past, when we've tracked foreclosures, over 60% of foreclosures are coming from subsidized housing. This may be different, right? This may be different. But we've also been in contact with all of the owners of subsidized housing and their management companies to talk about resources, the rights of tenants, et cetera. So I just wanted to throw that in there as well. And, if the percentages stay the same, we've been in constant contact with owners and management companies.
So Will
Will
has raised his hand. I'm assuming to answer this specific question about how you work with community organizations, and then we're going to go on to the other counselors who still have questions.
No, I was.
If it's not on this particular question, I'm going to go on to the other counselors.
All right, thank you.
Counselor Arroyo. Counselor Arroyo. Okay. We've also been joined by Counselor Matt O'Malley. Okay, he may have had to jump. So I have the following questions and suggestions, and I want to be clear, I'm strictly sticking to the language of the ordinance because that's what was introduced. And while I appreciate and understand this opportunity for OHS and the city to explain what it's trying to do in general in response to the eviction moratorium, what was introduced and why it's before this committee is not the general conversation, it's the specific language in the ordinance. So I have several suggestions to the city. And by that, I mean suggestions as in I plan on writing this into the ordinance. And unless you oppose it, I plan on presenting that version to my colleagues to vote on the 21st. Because this was also introduced with a sense of urgency. It was introduced on the, in the first week of October and trying to get ahead of this eviction moratorium with the suggestion that I suspend and pass the rules, which I've never done. So I'm trying to rush and specifically work on language here. So for the purpose of for those who seem to be confused, I am trying to get the ordinance finished and done and passed. While this has been a great conversation about other things that are outside of the ordinance, I'm going to keep the conversation to that. So here are the following suggestions we would put in
Counselor Edwards, I'm just flagging that I'm on. I can go after you, no rush, but I'm on my phone, so my presence was acting up. So just flagging. No rush. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm suggesting one, an annual ordinance or an annual mailing to all owners and or tenants, not just as a great initiative already done by OHS, but as a requirement from the city of Boston. On top of that, the lease suggestions from Councillor Bach, that as landlords go to engage with tenants, that they are also engaging with all their rights. I think, and I'll check with our lead laws and other notices that are required in the lease, whether they're coming from the state or coming from the city or from our sanitation code, but there might be a way in which municipal ordinance can require that. There's also the question of course, I think already the landlords being required to provide an additional notification of the rights, which is already proposed in this ordinance. I am also wanting to suggest that the city either through this or through its own, or this require then that the city go to the Boston Health Commission and declare the emergency, a health emergency. And for the entirety of the pandemic, as long as we have a pandemic. Also looking at whether we should be, along with the notices, the emergency, looking at whether we should be creating a landlord fund or some sort of financial incentive for landlords that will not evict or will cancel rent. These are suggested like languages that we would put into this pending ordinance right now. So it's before us, we get to play with it, we get to add things to it, we get to vote on it. Then the mayor can veto it. But I will say this, the current version as it is going to change. So I'm proposing the following changes, and the city council will have suggestions for that. So it's not passing as it is. So I'm pushing back to the city to say, of the things suggested, do you have any opposition to them? Anyone from the city?
Well, I think we'd have to take them under advisement, Council. We're just hearing about a few of those right now. So of course we'd have to, and I think we'd have to understand, have Corporation Council look at them as well.
Well, understanding again, time is of the essence. I would, then I can get that draft to you as soon as possible, or those suggestions. But if you're looking for something to get done by the 21st, which is 2 days formally after the, the Monday of the eviction moratorium, then I would really hope that you guys would take some of those suggestions quite seriously and put them in there. Or at the very minimum, we would put them in there, and then if the mayor chooses not to accept it, he would just have to veto it.
So is everything that you listed items that you're going to suggest be put in this ordinance?
Yes.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
Yeah, I think this ordinance is a good start. It is certainly not a finish, and there's certain powers the city needs to be exacting and pushing more. If the urgency is as extreme as we've just heard, if people are facing immense pressures, and if the city is doing everything it can, this ordinance isn't doing everything I think the city can be doing or pushing for landlords to do. There's also the very legal question I have, honestly, how are you going to protect people whose notices to quit will be collected by the Office of Housing Stability or any city agency? It's not just OHS. You're going to have information. So as Dominique described it, it's give notice that they're going to file a notice to quit, or is it actually filing a copy of the notices to quit with the Office of Housing Stability?
So it's the copy of the notices to quit. And we do.
So with that information, note this, in the current process, no one gets a copy of that besides the tenant. And then when you choose to go to court, that's private information. So now that is going to a public agency. Tell me how you would protect people from that information getting out there. If I'm a landlord and I already get to go through the court records right now to see who's pending an eviction, now I get to go now to Office of Housing Stability, submit a public records request every Friday and get a list of all the people who are potentially being evicted for my screening purposes. How do you protect people?
Sure. So we've had numerous conversations with the people in the city about this and about the foyability of those records. We feel that the tenant's information will be protected under privacy concerns, but we do feel that the information contained we feel that if our office received this information, that it's valuable information, but we acknowledge that it's an administrative burden to keep the records and have a system to keep those records.
Certainly. Yeah. And I think that ultimately the point would be that
legal issue of this being a public record or not.
So I think at the end of the day, that is definitely a concern that we also are not looking to make it accessible for landlords, to make it a little bit easier to, either deny housing for people who have an eviction record or have received a notice to quit in the past. So that is certainly a provision that we could, go ahead and either remove or tighten the language up on. But I do think that we have to try to move with expediency and try to make sure that this is passing as quickly as possible. So that way people can have the protections that are not, potential challenges to tenancy in the future. So I think we could work with you guys to maybe remove that provision or to change that provision around to protect that information for tenants, but I don't think that's something that should hold up the ordinance passing.
No, I don't either. I want you to get the language then that protects or excludes us from public records or what it takes to balance that interest, right? There's also a lot of advocacy groups that want access to that information as well. So there's interest in access to that information, there's also injury in access to that information.
Right.
And so how do you, through this language, balance both?
Right. Yeah, no, Counselor,
it's not right now. As it's written, it's not right now.
Yeah, so Counselor, as I had a conversation this morning with the law department about this exact issue, we did discuss it. We feel that the language in there would still protect people from FOIAbility, but that we would have to come up with, a very serious record storage and redactability or redaction policy for what information comes into OHS and just general information that is sent out in response to public records requests. You can talk about the type of landlords that have filed notices to quit and things like that. We had a long discussion about this, and we do feel that the tenant's private information would be protected, as would the landlord's information. But we do feel like that this is valuable information for us to have for many reasons that you just stated.
Yeah, no, so maybe you can inform us of then the law department's summary, or if you can shoot an email over there saying that this is protected information. That would
I have,
be
yeah, I do have, yes, I have that.
All right.
I'm happy to send it to you.
And then in terms of the self-reporting, is there a portal right now for a tenant to, wasn't informed of my rights, or would you create that for the Office of Fair Housing? If it's self-reporting and the tenants have got to do this, are you going to create something online in more than one language that I can click on saying, if I'm looking at tenants' rights and I see I didn't get a notice, I could file this complaint? Is that something that you're going to create?
So we could do that for the Office of House, for OHS. We can go ahead and add just kind of what Councilor Bach was asking for earlier, a question at our intake that would ask if a tenant has received this information. We would store it in our Salesforce system. I'm not sure if Fair Housing has a similar system for reporting. I mean, I know you guys do get complaints all the time and have some sort of mechanism to reach out to constituents when they're complaining about a fair housing issue. I'm not sure if you could expand on that.
Sure. Can you just ask the question again, Madam Chair, just so I can fully understand it?
So I understood the process was that tenants would be informed of their rights, but also if they were not given this, then they would be filing a complaint with your office, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and so OHS is kind of leading, informing people of their rights and knowing who's getting evicted. You are where people go once they know you have the right, or it's a legal obligation and they violated that, they go to your office.
Yes,
When I
ma'am.
go to your office, how am I going to your office? I'm suggesting, is there going to be a portal or some sort of online app like filing for your office?
I get what you're saying. I totally understand now. So they would go to our office the same way they normally come in now. They can either file it online with us. We do have an online intake system, or they can call it in because of COVID. So they can definitely call, or they can do when City Hall's open on the Tuesday, Thursday, Fridays. They could actually come in and do an in-person complaint here in our office, and we will take it there, and then we will begin to commence the investigation process.
Okay, and then kick it over to ISD for up to $300 a day.
Yes, ma'am. With our recommendation will just say that basically the landlord did or did not comply with the rules that OHS has put forward, or the ordinance. And
when
then
do you start counting the days? The day that they filed the notice to quit with, or the day that they gave it to the tenant and then didn't give this other piece of paper, to when do you stop counting?
So that's exactly it. From the day they gave it to the tenant. So from that date is what will determine. In fact, a tenant really wouldn't be able to come to it. Well, actually, I'm wrong. So you're right. It's from the date that they gave it to the tenant. Assuming that they gave the tenant it on, I don't know, October 1st, and the tenant came into us on October 13th, we will count it beginning from that day, meaning October 1st, if that makes sense.
Yep.
And not the actual date of the complaint.
No, I wanted to know. So now, you count from, let's say, today, let's just make it easy for purposes. It's the 1st, it's the 14th, that they come in to you and say, I should have gotten this piece of paper. That stops the clock and you only go look back those 14 days, or you continue to wait until the landlord actually provides that piece of paper to them, and only then do you stop and then look back?
I'm sorry, say that again.
I'm trying to figure out how this clock works. I come in on the 15th of the month. I should have gotten something, the notice to quit on the 1st. I didn't get my notice of rights. Okay. So, and I come to your office and file the complaint on the 15th. When I understand, for every single one of those days after I got my notice to quit, it's $300 a day, right? And
Yep,
that $300 goes to the city. It doesn't go to the tenant, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so now I'm counting each one of these days and looking at it and so on and so forth. And when does the clock stop?
Clock stops when the violation is corrected. So the landlord provides the information to the tenant.
So it could be forever. Or, when would you assess a lien then?
Liens are able to be assessed after 30 days of non-payment.
Mm-hmm.
So
So
it would have
$900 about.
Right.
At that point, you can assess repeatedly $900 liens on the property.
Exactly. And we wouldn't have to, if we're issuing a daily violation, we wouldn't have to do an assessment daily. 30 days out, we could accumulate those and do a quarterly lien, for example, or a monthly lien. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, this fine was issued on, November 1st. It wasn't paid on November 30th. So
is there any way to have some of that money go to the tenant? Would that, that would help something. That would help them get the money.
I was thinking about that. I think
$9,000. Sorry, I calculated it 30 times 30. It's like $9,000 for 30 days of this. So is there any way for the city to give that fine? That would help.
I think without creating a special revenue fund, municipal fines have to go into the general fund.
Could that fund then be, could you segment some of that for landlord relief or some sort of fund for tenants?
I think it's a really interesting idea. I think it would.
I just can't imagine you're collecting thousands of dollars a month, which I assume you will, because I don't know that landlords are going to take this seriously. But okay, fine, you start collecting, and the money starts collecting. Why isn't that recycled back to OHS or back to rent relief or something?
I've wrestled with this before, Madam Chair, and I believe that if to do something like that, it would require some kind of state action.
No, I think it does require a budget amendment. I think if we're getting revenue in,
right.
Check with Justin, but if we're getting revenue and we want to use it for a specific use, we're going to need, I think we're going to need to make some kind of budget adjustment and so I think I was actually thinking about that too earlier. Is there a way to have some of these funds dedicated? A&F doesn't love dedicated funds on revenue, but I think it's an interesting idea that we could explore quickly.
So for example, any such funds is collected as a violation of the Housing Notification Act shall be given to the general fund and used, and may be used, we can use may, so no one's freaked out, may be used for tenant relief purposes.
I think if you phrase it that way, it's, it stands up. But if it's a requirement that our funds are used for a certain purpose, then it sort of gets into that challenging area, but sure.
Okay. All right. So those are, what I can do then is get suggested language that kind of incorporates all of those suggestions to you. And again, if you want to voice any opposition or concerns or just outright, and then we can vote on something on the 21st and then it's in the mayor's court. Councillor Campbell?
Thank you, Councillor Edwards. And I agree with, I will say, some of your sentiment, which is particularly on the people's information sort of existing in our universe and people having access to it through a public records request. I do think you can put stronger language there. That's a concern that's come up. So I appreciate you bringing that up. And of course, you know, always looking for other ways to do more with respect to what's coming. You know, I want to say thank you to folks from the administration. I know how hard you guys are working. This is definitely unprecedented time. So I appreciate the hard work each and every one of you brings. I think some of my questions were answered previously, but just going back, and I think Chief Dillon, you summed this up well, you know, in addition to ensuring that residents have access to the information about their rights, lawyers and having lawyers is critically important. Of course, having resources in the immediate is critically important. I absolutely would support what Councillor Edwards was just talking about, which is if there's a way to which to redirect these fees and fines to a fund or to directly benefit the folks. I mean, we've seen that with, say, parking meter funds, redirecting it to things involving traffic, right? Things involving the transportation department. We've done that before. So I think it's a great idea to be able to redirect those funds to help people in the immediate with terms of the resources with respect to this crisis. But one of the one question or two questions I had, the first is, maybe I'll have another one in a second, but the first is around the notice piece and the mailings. You know, I know, Katie, you talked about the 46,000 mailings and being very intentional about going into certain communities, but we also know in the midst of the pandemic, not many folks are paying attention to mail or opening up their mail. So do we track, or, you know, do we have a sense of how successful that outreach is? And then two, have we looked at other ways in which to reach this population of folks? So, you know, through social media, ads on social media. Clearly, people still look at TV. I know we talked about BNN, but the main television stations, right? People are tuning into the news, being able to see something with respect to your rights. How do we partner with organizations, media outlets, or whatever with respect to this critical information, given the unprecedented times we're in? And I like to think that everyone wants people to remain housed because it's more expensive to have to deal with this issue once they're homeless. So I'm just curious, what are the outreach mechanisms exist? How do we pull in partners to be able to assist us in doing this on a pro bono basis? And if there's been any discussions around that in terms of pulling in partners around some of these other ideas around outreach. And then are we able to assess if the mailing strategy is effective or not?
So I'll answer first. In terms of outreach, we've been doing community outreach in terms of just getting to different, the city's hall, using the City Hall to Go ban, also making sure that we're doing outreach to some of the health clinics and some of the community partners that we've worked with in the past to also receive this information. We're planning to do a series of I guess you could call them kind of community conversations in partnership with the Housing Innovation Lab that is going to be talking about the rent relief fund, and that's opening back up. So talking with them, I know Katie also mentioned working with Moya to do some community outreach in different languages as well. So we're working in that regard to make sure that the information is getting out there to folks. In terms of feedback that we're getting so far, we just received earlier this afternoon our first phone call from a constituent who did receive the mailer and was, you know, curious to know a little bit more information about how they might receive resources. And we know that some of the folks, even in our office, have also seen some of the flyers getting out there. So I think that the word is for, you know, very new mailing is starting to move around the city. This is information that we definitely want to make sure is extremely accessible. DND does have an Instagram page. We're getting information out that way as well. So we're moving on this, and we definitely don't want to kind of hold those resources too close to the chest. We want to make sure that people are getting the information they need.
No, that's very helpful. And it was, offering up as just suggestions of other ways to reach folks, social media ads and various things seem to be the way to go in terms of advertising. At least when you look at folks, in the private sector, right, who are doing always sort of tracking ways in which people are receiving information. And so just bringing these ideas up as suggestions that have come into our office as ways in which to reach even more tenants who may not sort of traditionally sort of read or view their mail. Another question I have.
Counselor, if I could just also add, one of the
Yep.
other things that we're really interested in doing that we have done, I know it's not social media outreach, but anyone who emails the Office of Housing Stability, we have like 4 different email addresses. There's an automatic auto reply that links to these different resources where anyone who reaches out to our office, because we know thousands of people are going to be reaching out, will be linked into this information as well. So we're trying to, any connection that we have with people, we are definitely trying to make sure, desperately really trying to get them this information. And I will also check with our comms team on how we can track the mailer.
And then thank you for that. And thank you all. My last question is, when we think about partners, so whether it's the legal community, folks, law firms, folks are always asking how you can be helpful. And I'm always saying, well, people need lawyers, right? For different things, whether it's discrimination cases, housing cases, et cetera. Curious, Chief Dillon, from your perspective, I know you're always in contact with so many different agencies, what some of that partnership looks like in terms of the lawyer piece. We talked about the gaps in being able to mail more people, and part of that being budgetary, right? So what other partners might be stepping up to allow for greater outreach on the notification piece? What other stakeholders are showing up? I said lawyers, but it could be others in terms of partnerships to assist us in reaching as many people as possible and providing them immediate solutions, whether it's financially based or lawyers, while the state, of course, does what they're going to do. But obviously people still need short-term relief. So I'm curious what partners are showing up and how might we assist in pushing more folks to show up, particularly with respect to this issue?
Sure. Just a couple of things. We have gotten at various points in time, lots of city employees from different departments to answer phones, and they did it really well in multiple languages. So there has been this this real response from the city. And so if your folks in City Hall, that want to get plugged in, let us know. The lawyer piece is really important. And as I mentioned, the states, it's long overdue, but they are setting up a whole legal infrastructure, and hopefully they're doing it within weeks. Part of that is calling on volunteer attorneys, pro bono and retired, to help get plugged in. So, I know that you're an attorney. I'll get more information on that. They're working really hard on it. And if we could get that word out too, because they're going to be able to bring on new attorneys paid, but they are looking to augment the ranks with volunteers and pro bono. So, I wish they had put this in place weeks ago. Months ago, we were begging them, but
Right.
better late than never. Now we're going to push it along. But let me get information on how they are planning to utilize volunteers, legal volunteers, or people with legal backgrounds to help mediate or provide legal services. But I'll get that and I'll reach out to all of you.
Yeah, that would be helpful to know who's participating and how we can support, and also seeing who the partners currently are, and who isn't on a part of that list. Because, obviously there are numerous industries that are still doing very well right now that could step up in a whole host of ways to support this particular crisis that is upon us, and of course more to come next week. So that's it for now, but thank you all for the hard work you're doing. Really appreciate it. And obviously these hearings run long, so I appreciate you guys taking the time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councilor Flynn?
Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Edwards. Thank you to Sheila Dillon and her team for incredible work on this very difficult issue. I had a couple comments or questions. I want to apologize for being late first. I wanted to follow up on Councilor Campbell's comments about trying to get as many lawyers as we can to be helpful. So I'm just wondering, is there any way to begin that process now of seeking volunteers in various businesses or industry or city, or even coordinate lawyers among city agencies to coordinate what the plan of action might be?
So as I mentioned, there is a legal infrastructure being put in place, and not a moment too soon, and which I really appreciate, because it's hard for us to just get volunteers, and then, you know, as hundreds of cases come in, there really does need to be a organized infrastructure. So, but let me get information on that. It was being put together over the weekend once they realized there was going to be funding and and support for it, and I'll get that out to all of the city councilors, and maybe we can collectively, you know, get the word out and see if we can't rope a lot of our attorney friends and people in the legal profession to participate. So Councillor Flynn, I will follow up with you and Councillor Campbell and others on that.
Yeah, Renee, I know thank you, Sheila. And I know the landlords, the good landlords, will be helpful and they'll do the right thing. Unsure about the bad landlords. I was on Facebook, I was looking at CPA's Facebook today and reading stories about a lot of immigrants who are in the dilemma that we're facing now in the city, especially immigrants, a lot of workers that may work kind of non-traditional hours or pay wise. So they might not have the necessary documentation for tax purposes. That is frequent in the immigrant community, as you probably know. But for my constituents in the immigrant community, what can we do to be helpful to them? I know we talk about language access, but what any issues with fair housing that that fair housing laws might be in play?
Well, I will say, and then I'll hand it over to my colleagues at Fair Housing, but you know, for the undocumented who have not been able to get adequate unemployment or any unemployment, we've got to make sure that they're getting rental relief. We're putting out another 5 million, as OHS has mentioned. Monday, we're putting another 5 million. We've squirreled away even additional federal resources in case they are needed. And we're going to make sure that Boston residents get a whole lot of the state rent arrearage. So people have got to pay their rent, and it comes down to, you know, simple math. So we've got to make sure that those folks get the resources they need to stay in their homes until the economy, you know, comes back.
And for the immigrant community too, when they get a letter in the mail that says, you know, you haven't paid your rent, it's time to leave, that might not necessarily mean that they have to leave, but they might take it that way, getting some type of letter from a lawyer threatening legal action against them. So my question is, how can we help an immigrant that might not be familiar with our laws and our system, that even though you get a letter saying you have to leave, that's about the last thing you want to do is leave your apartment, in my opinion.
Well, I mean,
Katie,
yeah, I mean, well, one of the things we could do is pass an ordinance that allows a notification to go in with the notice to quit that lets them know that the notice to quit doesn't mean that they need to leave their house, that only a judge can evict them, which is why we're trying to be proactive here. But that is definitely something that we're concerned about, which is why we're, you know, sent the mailer out to the 46,000 households. And we definitely need to get that message across that a notice to quit is not an eviction notice. A lot of people are scared also to report their landlords if they're in the immigrant community, and we know that. And so we are working to make sure that all those things are safely reported. One of the things with the rental relief fund is we found a lot of our constituents who are in the immigrant community were scared to actually, they initially applied for the funds. And then when we sent them the application and needed more information about their landlord, they didn't follow through with the application for the assistance because they were worried about their status. So we try to get the information out about public charge and other information. So we're very aware of that heightened concern in that community. We're trying to do whatever we can. We're working with Moya and other offices to figure this out.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. And my last point is.
Sounds like I could.
Oh, yeah. Okay, Will. Yeah, sorry, Will.
I was just going to say, for your question, to be very honest with you, to do this would, all of us, especially the city of Boston, would have to engage in a serious education and outreach campaign. Katie is right in what she just said, but I mean, all of us. So one of the things we do is we go to night meetings and we do a lot of education and outreach about fair housing in general, but we would need to do that. And of course, once this ordinance passed, well, if it should pass, let me say that, then we would now add this to being part of our education and outreach campaign. But as a city on a whole, we would really need to, because the question you asked is something we see a lot oftentimes. And a lot of times when people get letters of notices to quit from landlords, especially if you're not someone who's savvy or does this kind of work, it's very threatening. You would think that in 30 days or 14 days or whatever, that you're going to that someone is going to show up, box all your things and throw you out. It's extremely scary. And we currently deal with that a lot. So my point very simply is that we would just really need to engage in a very aggressive strategy across the city for an education and outreach campaign that really teaches particularly, well, anyone, but you would have to focus on neighborhoods like yours or East Boston, where you have a heavy immigrant population, Hyde Park, Mattapan, and so on. But that's the type of campaign that would really need to happen.
Yeah, that's good information, Will. Thank you. And, you know, the night of the election that's coming up, we'll probably see 10,000 lawyers traveling to different cities and states across the country on the election results, but we should have 10,000 lawyers coming to Boston to help our tenants, especially our immigrant community and seniors. I'm just wondering, my final point is this, you know, it's such a desperate situation. I would be in favor of calling for additional revenue to help out our low-income residents. So I just wanted to throw that on the table, that it might be necessary for us as a city to look at other ways to raise revenue, because we're in a desperate situation here. I want to say thank you to Chief Dillon and say thank you to Councilor Edwards.
Okay, I think they've gone through all of the counselors, so with a list of questions specifically about the ordinance. It's 5:05, and I would just go through, if anybody, counselors especially, have some additional questions, you can raise your blue hand now. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead back and turn it over to the administration if they wanted to have any summary remarks.
No, I just thank you for your time. There's a lot of good suggestions here, good ideas. We stand at the ready, certainly, to receive those and process something we can all agree on as quickly as possible. It's one thing. It's just, one thing out of many, but certainly we'll follow up on, the volunteer lawyers. Councilor Flynn, I agree. This may take more resources, although, right now we're going to put another $5 million out. We're going to work with the state. We're going to make sure they're putting as much money as they can for this. So lots of hard work to come, but I do appreciate the conversation today.
Councilor Braden.
I'm really, I looked at the CDC, Katie, I looked at the CDC document, the form. Is it available in other languages or just in English?
Yes, so we just received those translations back today. They should be posted online, hopefully by tomorrow.
So in terms of emergency first aid, if things start to unwind over the weekend and Monday, I know you folks are standing ready to help, but in terms of getting word out to our communities and our community partners, is it just basically just the basic drill? It's a notice to quit. Don't leave your house, and contact your offices. Then that's the way to go.
Yeah,
First aid.
have them contact the Office of Housing Stability, certainly. And the state setting up a 211 line too, where they're going to, so yes, have them contact the Office of Housing Stability if they have any questions about their, legal rights and what they need to do.
And
Okay.
Counselor Braden, there is a training tonight that Dominique's conducting with the Greater Boston Legal Services for council staff. It's going to be recorded, so that's going to be a very useful training for other things that you can tell your constituents as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you all so much. This is really an incredible situation we find ourselves in. And thank you for all your hard work and your commitment to fair play and housing justice. Thank you.
Counselor, the only thing that I would add is that the Office of Fair Housing Equity is excited to do this, but I do want to be very realistic that we will need additional resources to do this, just based on the sheer numbers that you see or that's already mentioned in the proposed ordinance. If you took just, which is north of 43,000 potential evictions, just 5% of that is 2,127. The reason I bring that up is that if we even had that many complaints in this office on top of what we already do, it would overrun us. So this is something we can do. It's not a difficult investigation, but it's one that we would need additional resources in order to make sure that it is successful. I just want to be very realistic about that. And I'm sure we could talk about that at some other point, but I did want to mention that.
Thank you.
Are there any other counselors that have some concluding remarks? Just going in order. I think Counselor Bach may have had to leave. So that leaves Counselor Baker. I think he also had to leave. Counselor Sabi George, if he's still here. Counselor Mejia. Counselor Arroyo. Counselor O'Malley. Counselor Campbell.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your work here. And of course, thank you again to the administration and everyone for their hard work. I just want to continue to echo that. We obviously get a lot of constituent cases and forward it your way. We can't do the work alone. So I just want to say thank you. We'll, of course, continue to follow it, look for an updated version with some edits and go from there. So thank you all. And thank you, Madam Chair.
Counselor Flynn. Okay. All right, so we'll get you an updated version and hope that we can discuss and have something that we all can agree on the 21st. Take care.